this afternoon we're joined by Dr. Andrew Wilson. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, I understand that this afternoon you're involved in a panel
Yes.
at the Property Expo.
Yes.
And the topic is big data analytics.
Well, look, we're going to discuss, I guess, that granular process of understanding what's happening in the housing market, and I think that's what data's all about. But we have to sort of enrich data, don't we, to be able to drill down and find out, you know, the underlying drivers of what the data actually means. And I think that's the most important thing about, you know, analysing housing markets is not just the what, but also the why. Because if we know the why, then we know where we're going.
Yeah.
And we're going to discuss about where the Sydney housing market's going, and also our other capital city housing markets this afternoon as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, the title Big Data Analytics is actually transliterated from Chinese.
Okay.
And I guess from those three words, they're small words, but they mean so much more. In terms of the property market, do you want to give us a bit of an insight as to which topics you'll cover this afternoon?
Well, look, we've recently had the federal budget, which is the Australian financial position that's projected for next year. And it was a very interesting budget because even though there weren't any specific policies in regard to property markets, the macroeconomic policies were profound in terms of their likely impact on housing markets, and that's in regard to migration.
Yep.
Australia has been recording near record levels of migration over the last year or so, and the budget confirmed that they will continue with those record levels of migration. In fact, most of the jobs growth that's come into Australia, most of Australia's jobs growth over the last year, over the last 2 years, has actually been generated from migration. That's increased the government's revenue from tax takings, which is good news for the government. They were able to give some of that back to taxpayers, just some, a little bit, but certainly that's better than losing tax, I guess, higher taxes. So migration is the key driver of the Australian economy currently. Migration means demand for housing. Now, we're still an undersupplied, most capital cities are undersupplied in terms of the demand for housing. At the moment in Sydney, we have demand for around about 1,100 new households every week.
Yeah.
That's what we have to find every week to 1,100 new households for people coming in and first home buyers. In Melbourne, it's 1,800 new household demand every week. So with migration, of course, fueling this demand, it means there's a lot of pressure on supply, and supply does tend to lag demand. And at the moment, we've actually come to the peak of the supply cycle in Melbourne and Sydney. So there will actually be fewer homes coming into the market as demand is continuing to increase. So that's, I guess, good news if you're a homeowner, good news if you're an investor and a developer. But look, if you're looking to buy a home, I guess that's not as such good news, because it will likely mean either paying higher rents while you're waiting to buy, or having to pay more for your home when you eventually do purchase it. So the big item in terms of what's happening in the housing market recently has been the budget.
Yeah.
More people means more homes, and that's a positive for the property industry.
Yeah, of course. I suppose in terms of migration, our expo is centred around the Chinese migration and how much the Chinese market can bring to our property market. How do you think Australian and Chinese businesses alike can liaise better to develop that relationship in terms of the property market here?
Well, I think that there needs to be a positive understanding about the connection that the Chinese have to our property markets. I think that most Australians have almost an inherent connection. It's almost in their DNA focus that property is a safe haven for capital and for investment. We have a saying, of course, safe as houses, which means, of course, that property investment has that security, that blue chip element to it. And we also have another saying as bricks and mortar, which is another, truism or saying that reflects on high regard for investment or ownership of housing. And I think Chinese understand those types of insights that Australians really have. And most Australians, of course, all Australians really, or at some stage came from a migrant background, particularly our new Australian cultures, and most of those cultures have that same high regard for property ownership and property investment. I think that's a good connection that the Chinese have with the Australian market, is that high regard. And I think that's why Chinese buyers and investors and developers are so attached and are increasingly attached to Australian housing markets, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And it's not just about the financial connections, the understanding of investment in housing, it's also strong cultural connections. We have very strong communities in Melbourne and Sydney, very strong Chinese communities, and they are growing. We have very strong business connections, with more and more business with China. Australia encourages Chinese Australian business relationships. And of course, we have a very strong student population, and Australia relies very strongly, I'm using that word a lot, but relies significantly on income from Chinese students. It is a big industry for Australia, and again, that's another strong connection, with China through our education industry. So, look, I think that there are cultural, there are, perceptions of property, business, connections, financial connections, that I think we all need to understand that we have in common. I think there was a lot of a sense last year that for various reasons we'd see fewer active Chinese buyers and investors in the Australian market. Of course, it became more difficult to export capital from China, use that term, and also there were some higher price import costs put on money coming into Australia for real estate investment. But we've really seen no slowing down, and I think that that's another reflection of the strong connection, ongoing connection, underlying connection that China has and Chinese buyers have for Australian real estate.
Yeah, okay, great. So you mentioned the, competitive rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney.
Yes.
And how they're very different markets, but also
Yes.
very similar. And I was just wondering why you think, that Melbourne has been, year after year, voted the most livable city in the world, and Sydney's quite far behind.
Well, firstly, I have to say that I was born and raised in Melbourne.
Oh, there we go.
My children all live in Melbourne. But you asked me the question, why has Melbourne been voted the most livable city?
Yeah.
Well, my honest answer is I don't know. I live in Sydney, and I think Sydney's a very livable place. But of course, it is an individual,
yes.
Subjective analysis, a subjective view of where you live, and where we're born and raised. We always have a strong sentimental attachment to those particular places. But look, Melbourne certainly is more affordable than Sydney.
Yeah.
Sydney at a certain level. It is a city which is perhaps more amenable and perhaps more livable than Sydney under certain criteria. But depends on what your criteria are. Sydney has, of course, world-class tourist attractions. It has an amazing tourist magnet. It is an amazing tourist magnet. It has, a warmer climate, which can be a positive. It has a stronger economy also, which can be a positive. But there's a lot more people in Sydney. It does spread further out.
Yeah.
There are issues to do with, commuting, which Melbourne's now starting to experience as well. But I think it's a part of that sort of rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. And I've just got a bit of a feeling that Melbourne likes to generate the rivalry,
Yes,
and that
me
Sydney's
too.
quite relaxed about it all at the end of the day.
No, I agree. One final point. What advice would you give to current home buyers that are looking for a house in one of the capital cities?
Well, look, it's always about your personal choices, and I think it's always better to get into the market and make your choices based on, the top 5 out of your top 10 choices, but get in as early as you can. We're not in a market now where prices are rising as fast as they have in recent years, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and that's a product that interest rates have been on hold now for a record period of over 18 months. And once that falling interest rate energy leaves the marketplace, prices tend to flatten out. So there's not the worry now of getting in before prices continue to increase. But in markets such as Sydney and Melbourne, where demand is and will remain ahead of supply, it's also about choice. And you want to be able to make the best choice you can, but as soon as possible. And those markets, Melbourne and Sydney, and most Australian capital city markets, have very tight rental markets, higher rents. It's very tough to rent a property in Sydney and Melbourne, high demand, and I think that the culture of home ownership is a positive compared to having to rent. So get in, I would suggest, sooner rather than later. Don't be too picky in terms of your choices, and take advantage of what really are the best lending conditions we've ever had in this country. Interest rates have never been lower than this. Banks are ready to do business. You don't have to qualify by being with a particular bank for a period of time. You can just walk through the door, and if you qualify in terms of your income and your deposit, you'll get the loan. So, and it is, as we discussed at the very beginning of the interview, we have that sense that once we're a homeowner, we've made it.
Yep.
Right? So get in and make it as soon as you can. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Andrew Wilson,
That's
for joining
all right.
us this afternoon.
That's
Thank
okay.
you.